So what I try to do, as I've said quite a few times since this all began, is to try and elevate voices which won't be heard elsewhere and should be. And someone who I've been reading a lot, as have many of you actually, which we'll talk about, is an Israeli academic named Mordechai, who is a history academic. And what he's done is he's used his position as a citizen to speak out. And two words which I think you're, maybe hopefully you're not bored of me hearing as listeners, is moral clarity, which I think have been the two, for me, most important words since this all began. And Lee has, I think, shown moral clarity in ways which I think are very profound, very moving, and extremely courageous for reasons I think we'll discuss. And just before I just bring Lee in, as he sits here waiting for me to stop talking, he wrote a viral thread. It went huge numbers of you shared it, commented on it. I can see here got 1.9 million views, including a document where he writes, is entitled "Bearing Witness to the Israel-Gaza War," which begins, "I, Lee Mordechai, a historian and Israeli citizen, bear witness in this document as events are unfolding to the horrible situation in the Gaza Strip." Lee, hello. How are you doing?
Hey, Owen. Great to be on. Thanks for having me on. It's an honor.
No, it's honors all mine, honestly. I just want to start because you call this bearing witness, and I'm just interested. Why is it so important to speak out? I mean, it's really interesting reading through the document you've written, a very long, thorough, detailed document, which I can see your academic training really comes in. It's very evidenced about what's happening in Gaza and why you consider this to be a genocide, which I'll come on to. And it almost reads partly, it almost comes across as a missive to the future. It almost reads like, in generations to come, you put a marker down, that you knew what was happening, that people knew what was happening at the time. What was the main purpose for you? Is it a moral imperative? Is it so to say, well, actually, people can't say they didn't know what was happening? I don't know. What for you was so important about speaking out?
So I think, yes, it's more or less that. It's the idea of trying to figure out what is going on in this war. And it's not always that easy to understand what exactly is going on in the war. But what I try to do is understand what is going on in the war as events were unfolding. And this is a document that I've been working on for somewhere around 5 months at this point, and I keep updating it, right? So the first versions are pretty much more simple, much shorter, less detailed than the one that is currently circulating. And every several weeks, I publish one of these versions, usually get a lot of feedback, both positive and negative feedback, take that into consideration, kind of like rethink my positions. Maybe someone has a strong point from either side. And I try to reflect on that and kind of like incorporate that into the next version in one way or another. I mean, I don't necessarily have to agree, obviously, with what people say. But I can give like different examples of this. So in one of the versions, people kind of picked up on the death toll in Gaza, right? And this is like mainly an Israeli critique in Hebrew. People essentially saying, "Oh, you're accepting the Hamas numbers, so therefore everything you say is essentially rubbish." And so I kind of forced myself to try to figure out what are these numbers actually, where are they coming from, and also who is arguing against these numbers, why, in what context. And I believe there has been and still is, especially over the past few days, a more or less concentrated effort to cast doubt on those numbers. And I incorporated that within the document.
I can see, again, you can see your academic training there, where you're constantly thinking through, challenging, critiquing, trying to make sure what you argue is evidence. And you make clear, actually, don't you? You say that you try to write this in a kind of, you say in cold, unemotional language to try and avoid trying to sway readers' opinions. So you're trying to just say the facts speak for themselves. I'm interested. You write, the evidence I've seen and described below has been sufficient for me to believe that what Israel is currently doing to the Palestinian people in Gaza is a crime against humanity that is consistent with the definition of genocide, as I understand it. Do you want to explain why you arrived at that conclusion?
So it was a process. I mean, at the beginning, and this is also part of why I decided to publish these. I mean, so if you want, you can look at my Twitter feed and kind of like see how my thinking has developed over time. But at the beginning, I did not think that way. But as I saw more and more evidence, it just seemed to be the best term. I mean, what other term? This is not really a war crime, right? It's a combination of many war crimes that ends up being, I mean, again, the best word I could think of to describe this is a genocide. And I actually have like an entire section, again, based on comments that I've received, in which I lay out the evidence and try to make an argument as to why this is the case. And I essentially point to both a number of killed Palestinians, the number of wounded Palestinians, just percentage-wise. And currently, we're speaking about somewhere around 5% of the population of Gaza being either killed or wounded, which in my mind already is enough. But there's also the question of humanitarian aid and blocking or withholding or limiting or hindering the entrance of humanitarian aid, which I think is also strong enough evidence, because this is consistent over such a long time, that again, how else are we supposed to understand this? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm open for like other ideas, but again, I think this is the best word to use to describe the current situation.
I wonder. I wonder what you think as a historian. Actually, is that in terms of those who've challenged the idea that this is genocide, they've relied on, I suppose, an ignorance of the history of genocide, in that genocide is far more common in human history than people think. And because there was an ignorance of that history, the kind of point of reference for the vast majority of people is the Holocaust. But the Holocaust, in lots of ways, is an outlier in the history of genocides. It was an industrialized attempt to exterminate an entire people, succeeding obviously in killing, slaughtering 2/3 of Europe's Jews in a very short space of time against a defenseless population. I mean, the Nazis had to contrive deranged conspiracy theories, such as Bolshevism was a Jewish plot, and therefore this was the, therefore they are mass murderers, and therefore they had to make up kind of, this is self-defense because of these conspiracy theories, or there was a Jewish plot to create or to cause World War I, or the stab in the back to defeat Germany in World War I, that kind of thing. Whereas in actual fact, if you look at Rwanda, we're aware of the Hutu extremists slaughtering the Tutsi population, but there was a Tutsi rebel force which committed atrocities. There was an invasion from Uganda in 1990. Hutu extremists, they said that this was an attempt to commit genocide against the Hutu population. If we don't kill them, they'll kill us. Mm-hmm. Therefore, self-defense. And it's not the same. I'm not trying to. These are all different in their own context and in manner, scale. The Bosnian Serb population, again, they suffered atrocities. I'm just wondering what you think about that. Do you think that's part of the issue, that understand it, because genocides throughout history have often been justified on the basis of self-defense? So that's not really understood.
So I'll reframe this, right? Because in a sense, I think that part of the challenge in this war is to stay focused, right? Stay focused on what actually matters. And at the end of the day, right, we can go on and debate on and on whether this is genocide, or whether it's one step or two steps or three steps, or just plausibly a genocide. But is that really the point, right? Is that really what is important here? And I would argue that, to an extent, yes, because that's like a frame. It's an easy frame within which we can discuss or understand what is going on with Gaza. But I think that the horrors in Gaza, should be stopped, right? That is perhaps the first and most important point. And there are going to be people who are going to discuss whether this is or is not genocide for several years to come. They will reach their own conclusion, which may or may not be the same as my conclusion. But in a sense, it's a discussion that is of limited value, right? I mean, you do not need to agree with me, or we do not have to agree whether this is or is not genocide for us to take action. And I think taking action and speaking up is what is important right now. I mean, I started speaking up before I thought this was a genocide because, again, the horror of the situation.
It's really interesting because you write Israel has actively attempted to cause the death of the civilian population of Gaza. Israel has created famine in Gaza as a de facto policy and used it as a weapon of war, resulting in the deaths of dozens of civilians, mainly children from starvation. Israel created shortages of water, medicine, and electricity. It's interesting because Ari Neher, the former executive director of both Human Rights Watch and the American Civil Liberties Union, himself from a family of Holocaust survivors, I mean, he this week came to the conclusion that genocide based on the point you've just raised there. I mean, I find that interesting just because, I mean, from the beginning, Yoav Gallant said that he said on the 9th of October, we're cutting off and then all the essentials of life on the basis we're fighting human animals. And then 2 weeks later, Major General Ghassan Allen, the Israeli army coordinator of Kogat, which is in charge of the occupied territories, he clarified by human animals, they meant the civilian population. He said Hamas became ISIS and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human animals are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade on Gaza. No electricity, no water, just damage. You wanted hell, you will get hell. The reason I raise that is it strikes me actually, I mean, Raz Segal, actually another Israeli-American academic, he said it's rare for intent to be so overtly spoken. Normally, you have to go through leaked documents.
Mm-hmm.
People, the rhetoric is of course we're not doing this.
Yep.
I'm interested in that because just in terms of what you said, it is what was promised. It's not like it's not a tinfoil hat kind of. It's just they put a total siege of all the essentials of life was promised on the basis the civilian population were collectively guilty, and then that happened.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, so this is another one of these questions that I, as a historian, am kind of struggling with, right? Because you do get, on one hand, these very clear indications of intent. But then if you actually look at the number of trucks, for example, that go into Gaza, so yes, at the beginning, there are, I think, 2 or 3 weeks in which nothing comes in. But then they start putting in things, right? They start letting in some trucks. So I mean, the way I see this is that there's this strategy that allows for some deniability, right? So take, for example, one of the big stories of the past few days, right? The humanitarian aid trucks that were stopped at the roadblock, essentially within Israel, essentially destroyed and also set on fire by Israeli protesters. The indications that I've seen, eyewitnesses on site pointed out that both the military and the police were kind of like around there and kind of let all this happen in one way or another. So this is part of the strategy of, on one hand, allowing some in, not allowing everything, helping other people limit the entrance of aid. So when I am trying to write about stories such as this, I mean, yes, I think the early declarations of intent were important, partially because they were like an indication of quote unquote the spirit, right? The spirit of the commander or the zeitgeist or how we're supposed to behave right now. But they were not taken literally until now, right? And I think this is part of the problem in trying to make sense of all of this. Because again, if you look at the graphs that are put out by actually quite a few different organizations, you get these ups and downs, and these ups and downs in the amount of aid going in, and also the ups and downs in the prices of products within the Gaza Strip, right? This is also an indication that kind of tells you how bad things are. And there are clearly times when things are bad and times when things are not as bad or are horrible and only partially horrible. Right. And it is more difficult for people like me, I think, to try to come up with a description, a consistent description about the entire thing, right? So I guess maybe you mentioned Serbia earlier and Bosnia. Um, is the entire thing genocide or only part of it genocide? And again, I don't want to take a position on this because even if part of it is genocide, it's bad enough, right? Or even if it's not genocide and it's only plausibly genocide, that's also bad enough. It's also not a place where one should be happy to live, I think. I don't know.
I mean, in terms of, I guess, a way of summing it up, I mean, in terms of the issue is the presence of the Palestinian people in Gaza is widely seen as undesirable. And that is a position much of the Israeli government openly states when they...
Yeah, I think that's for sure. That's very clear. I mean, and there are plenty of indications, and that I think has been consistent over time. What exactly should be done with these people? I think there have been several plans, which may or may not have like operated at the same time. There still are, I think, different options on the table, and eventually one or another option would be selected. But I don't think we've reached that stage. I do agree that the presence of Palestinians there, definitely at these numbers, is undesirable, and I mean to the Israeli government at least.
I'm really interested. I mean, when I say a case study, I'm not talking about an experiment here. We're talking about real people, real lives, and a horrific crime. But I am interested in how societies at any point can be, where an other is dehumanized to such a degree that an atrocity is made possible. And that dehumanization is always a precondition throughout history for atrocities, including atrocities committed by Britain and currently in Ireland. And Ireland suffered horrific crimes at the hands of British rule, and the dehumanization of the Irish people was always critical, because most people aren't sociopaths. Most people, it's a tiny proportion of any given population. It's when you stop seeing another as a human like you. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the issue, isn't it? I mean, if there were scenes, these horrible scenes involving Palestinian babies suffering terrible injuries, and many Israeli citizens saw that as if that was an Israeli baby, then immediately the power of emotion would kick in. But there's something. I mean, that's the level of dehumanization we're talking about, isn't it? It's just they're just not seen as people like us. That's the issue, and because of the nature of decades of occupation, settlement. I'm just interested in just how entrenched that dehumanization is.
I think it is, but it's doubly so, right? Because I mean, there is dehumanization, but there's also a kind of invisibility, right? So one of the polls that came out last month in April pointed out that about 2/3 of Jewish Israelis claim they've seen either few images of videos about the destruction in Gaza. And destruction, when Israeli media shows something, it's usually the destruction rather than the people, right? So you see buildings like being blown up. So 2/3 of people saw either few or none at all. And if this war is being sanitized, right? If it's like essentially airbrushed from your consciousness and you're not aware of what is going on, and you actually are not really interested in looking at these things because they do seem horrible, and I mean, why should you actually worry, right? I mean, this is how I think people rationalize this. So yes, I mean, these other people are human animals or monsters or whatever, and whatever is being done to them can be seen as justified. I mean, I can say that one of the things that made me realize the humanity on the other side is essentially that, right? It's these videos of essentially people being hurt, people speaking about their own experiences, either more or less dramatically. These individual stories that, as a human, I think I can sympathize and identify with. I mean, these people on both sides, by the way. I mean, whether it's the hostages or Palestinians from Gaza, right? I mean, these people could have been me, or it could have been my family members, could have been, I don't know, my friends. And I was lucky enough to live, work, be born, live, work slightly, I mean, half an hour away, right? But I mean, if things were a bit different, I mean, I could have been on either side of this.
I mean, one thing I'm interested in, just in terms of, I mentioned before, and it's a parallel I've thought about a lot. There's huge differences. I mean, you know, all of these contexts are unique, but Serb nationalism, I just think there's some interesting parallels in, and I'm just interested what you think in terms of this, in terms of the psyche, a collective psyche, which is when a sense of victimhood collides with a sense of supremacy. Because Serb nationalism was steeped in the sense of victimhood, because the Serbs were victims of genocide in World War II, including at the hands of the Croatian collaborators, the Ustashi, who were, I mean, the Nazis thought the Ustashi were extreme.
Yeah.
And they often, when they looked at, for example, the demographic makeup of Bosnia, and obviously that was in the early 90s, I mean, 45 years after their own genocide they suffered, they would blame their depopulation on that genocide. And they suffered terrible atrocities. I mean, terrible, thousands of Serb civilians were killed in the Bosnian War. And there was also a sense of supremacy. Serb nationalism taught them that they're better, they're superior to the Bosniaks, who were, and they obviously saw them as Muslim inferior people. I just wonder, is that partly what's happened here? Which is, I mean, we're talking in the case of the Jewish people, 2,000 years of persecution culminating within living memory with the Holocaust. And we have the atrocities that were committed, for example, on the 7th of October against Israeli citizens. So you have a sense of victimhood, which is based in reality. And then you have a sense of supremacy, which is Palestinians are inferior. Is that partly, is that partly what's kind of, you think, at play there?
Yeah, I think for sure. There's no doubt that is the case. And you see that in the discourse, right? So when people speak, the points of reference are the Holocaust and Nazis. I mean, there still are comparisons between Hamas and October 7 to the Nazis and the Holocaust. And there's obviously a lot of discussion about October 7 and how that essentially justifies anything that happens afterwards. And I think that is the weak position, right? Because the fact that an atrocity, a horrible atrocity, I cannot see how anyone would condone attacking innocent civilians on one side and not on the other side. So if someone, I mean, but even if you suffer such an atrocity, it does not mean you have like a carte blanche to do whatever you want, right? It doesn't work that way. And I think especially, I mean, and in the context of this particular war, October 7 is still being discussed as justifying everything that happened afterwards. And again, I have difficulties with that. I mean, we can grieve and mourn. I mean, perhaps even take revenge in some form or way, or retaliate in some form or way, without going to the extreme that we Israel, that is, of course, right, that we currently are doing. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me is this sense of cognitive dissonance that sometimes seems to emerge, which is, so if you make, you know, the accusation of genocide which has been leveled against the state of Israel, and Israeli ministers will respond with, "How dare you? That's an outrage. That's it's blood libel." And I think the average Israeli citizen would find that a grievous, again, respond very angrily. And yet, if you look at the polling of, say, Israeli Jewish citizens, and we do that demarcation for those, just for everyone's aware, because 20% of Israel's population are Palestinian citizens, and they have different attitudes. But it's something like 70% oppose all humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, which by definition would just mean everybody dies. I mean, that's just genocidal if people thought about it long enough, for more than 5 seconds, I would say. Whereas, and Israeli, again, Jewish public opinion is divided on whether too little firepower has been used or just enough, with about 3% saying too little. And then you hear the statements of Israeli ministers, and they are genocidal. I mean, if you think about what that actually means, that the implications are genocidal. So I'm just wondering how that is kind of sits. How can if you support ending all humanitarian aid, and you think looking at what's happened to Gaza, not enough firepower is being used, and then you're also angry at the accusation of genocide. What's going on there psychologically? I find that difficult to understand.
I mean, my sense is that there isn't a real deep discussion of what is actually going on, right? So discussion, to the extent that it happens, is pretty superficial, tends to focus on again, these superficial talking points and much more emotion than facts, right? So I mean, the value of facts, of bringing in like the evidence, collecting evidence like I've done, right? I mean, it's not something that's valued within discourse in Israeli society, and I think that has been the case earlier on as well. So you have that on one side, and on the other side, I think there are little to no, more likely no consequences for speaking like that, right? So if you speak like that and you see no consequences and no one stops you from speaking in those terms, so I mean, it just like goes on, and then you can have these discussions about whether children who are 4 years old and under are innocent or not, and this would actually be a discussion on TV, right? I mean, you would have one person that says that, okay, we need to kill everyone, and one person says, oh, I mean, like the small children are like innocent, or like 0 to 4 are innocent. And then you have like other people who just like go on and say, yeah, we need to kill fetuses as well, right? So when there's no consequences to that kind of language being used, I mean, if you're in there for the rating or the popularity, or you're like looking to for a job or something, I mean, you just feel more free to speak in that way. And I personally find this abhorrent, right? And that's part of why I'm speaking up.
I mean, that's one thing I'm interested in terms of, when I first moved to London, I remember meeting a young South African woman, and I struck up a conversation. She was friendly, which was rare for me. Going to London, suddenly someone was speaking, a stranger. It's not the done thing in London. So I was cheerful to speak to her. I mentioned that my dad had met, Tarbin and Becky back in the 1960s, and she just said apartheid wasn't working anymore. And I was chilled by that. I didn't like that answer, obviously. I found it disturbing. The point I'm making is, in the end, white South Africans, to be honest, most of them were pretty invested in that system, but they realized there were too many consequences. And I'm just wondering what you just explained there, because I sometimes watch these clips on Israeli television, and there was rightly outrage about some of the clips on Russian television. And then I watch some of these, and they're literally debating killing children. And people say, no, we need to kill, they'll turn up to be terrorists, and you just listen, and then Giava Island is a former Israeli general, and he talks about the poor women. Don't talk to me about the poor women of Gaza. They're all the wives of terrorists. I just kind of, is it impunity? Is that basically when there's just nothing to stop you speaking like that? You just don't think there are any consequences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the case, right? Why, if you're trying to make a point, and again, there are no consequences, no implications to what you're saying, no one holding you for account, I mean, morally, ethically. So I mean, you just like go on, and as you and I'm sure many of the listeners know, there's like an entire list, a long list of these kind of statements made by people. Now, I think part of the problem here is also the international media, right? Because international media does not report. I mean, so a lot of this stuff does come out, but it's usually through social media, right? So you get these clips of whatever, like Israeli TV, and they're like usually subtitled into English, and you can like get a feeling of the conversations that are going on there. But this kind of discourse is not something that is being reported on in, let's say, the New York Times, right? Or the Guardian. Right. If anything, those institutions or those media outlets have their own, or packaging their own version of Israel that they're kind of like trying to disseminate among their readership or audiences. And I think there is as a person who is kind of like in both worlds, as an academic, most of my connections are here in the United States still. There's this discrepancy, right, between how the image I get from Israel as an Israeli being on the ground, and the image I get, the image of Israel I get from, let's say again, the New York Times is maybe the best example.
I'm interested in that, in terms of you and what kind of you speaking out kind of represents in that way, because I think lots of people, it's very easy from the outside to look at a society and to critique it, and to take a step back. You weren't raised in a particular culture with a certain shared assumptions, which, and the sense of nationalism, which is very powerful in all societies, which to a degree, is ingrained in all of us. So when people look at, from the Western perspective, look at Russia and the things that are said, it's very easy to just take and to think that in that context you would speak out as well. I know Russia is obviously a far more is an authoritarian, kleptocracy, but within Israel, I think lots of people would think, well, if I was in Israel, I would, I would be speaking out and be courageous. But actually, the odds are, just statistically, you wouldn't. Most people, you are rare, and I've noted, I've spoken to so many courageous Israeli voices on this channel, and you're courageous because you're isolated. How is it possible to take the step out of your society in this context and to give this kind of cold, necessary analysis is very hard. And I'm just wondering, what made that possible for you?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, it's hard to say, right? Because I mean, I'm currently this year on sabbatical in the United States, so it gave me kind of like a distance from which I could view everything, and I had a lot of time through which I could read, think, reflect on what I've been seeing, and come up with my own opinion, and have the leisure to do this, right? I mean, I think that had I been teaching in Israel this year, I'm not sure I would be able to even conceive of this idea, right? So for me, that has been, I mean, that's the reason, right? Just like being removed from that has made it much easier for me to slow down, kind of like stay with my thoughts, being isolated already, essentially, right? I mean, I remember I started working on this during winter break, right? Where there was like nothing really to do around. I was like sitting at home, and I was like trying to figure out what is my role within this like broader, this unprecedented, really historical event with regards to, I mean, in my lifetime. And I just ended up that figuring out that, I mean, I felt that I needed to take some action, and writing, I think, was writing as an academic, really. I mean, in this like very academic style, was the easiest way for me to get involved, I think. I agree with you with what you said earlier. I mean, criticizing like Putin or any other like autocrat like in a different country, I mean, it's very easy to do, right? It's not, you're not actually paying any price for that. And I think that once you're willing to risk your comfort, your livelihood, your relationships, I think is also something that's definitely on the line, right? So once you're, the way I see it, when things are bad enough, right? And there's like levels, right? Because at a certain level, you do something, and if things are worse, you do something more. If things are bad enough, I personally have decided early on in this war that I am willing to risk this, and I risked, and have been willing, and still am willing to pay a price. But I think, again, as you said, there is a difference as to whether you do this when there are no real costs involved, right? Because I mean, we can go on and on for like an hour about Putin now, and I mean, it doesn't really going to impact our lives in any way, right? But if both of us were Russians currently in Russia, that's like in a completely different situation, right? And then I think it's there you're bringing in your moral clarity, your I mean, essentially critique of the society in which you live, and are putting yourself on the line, right? You're willing to risk. We would be willing to risk were we Russians. all so much more than just a bunch of people in Dublin and New Jersey talking about this, right? So I think this is that's how I see this.
Just as a hope, because I always like to, and kind of the final part of these discussions, look for hope in what often seems like a desperately hopeless situation. But you have to have hope. I just don't think this level of kind of radicalization, dehumanization is sustainable for society. It strikes me as just not sustainable. And it also strikes me that it's causing, in any case, a divorce between the Israeli state and Israeli society in terms of public opinion and Western public opinion, which hasn't really existed before. Yeah. In the US, attitudes have shifted very dramatically. More Americans than not say genocide is taking place. There's a large number who say don't know. That's pretty damning enough in its own terms, I would say. Mm-hmm. And a large majority of Americans disapprove of Israel's actions. A lot of people might go, well, God, I mean, if it's after this, you know, what does it take? But I don't think people realize in the US just, you know, how much of a shift that is. And amongst younger Americans, it's really profound. So I'm just wondering, do you think that actually, you know, this is why I have hope for people like yourself, because actually I just don't see how what you're up against is just sustainable. I don't see how a society like Israel can, you know, it's kind of like a hothouse where it just kind of gets more and more extreme in ways that just corrupts society itself. And also the countries which it relies on diplomatically, militarily, and for aid, you know, I think patience is wearing pretty thin. So what do you think? I mean, do you think that's where kind of hope lies?
I mean, I am not an optimistic person personally, I think. But I do see hope, I think, in the action that people are taking, right? And I think one of the examples of this are the Gaza encampments, right? And we can debate now whether everything they said or did is justified or unjustified. And I think that would not be a very useful debate to have. But I mean, I prefer to see things, and having gone out there here at Princeton actually, and spoken to people on both sides as well, it seems to me to be optimistic. I mean, I see optimism there, as in students in on the other side of the world, really deciding to commit themselves, risking a lot, risking getting doxxed, getting evicted from their housing. This happened here. Getting expelled from school happened here as well. Going on these hunger strikes, and again, they may or may not be misguided. You may or may not agree with what they're saying or doing, but they are fighting for what they believe are right, and within my own moral calculus, right, of them being willing to risk essentially their futures, right? I mean, getting expelled from Princeton, I mean, after working so hard to get here, right, is not something to be taken lightly. Yet they're willing to do that, right? And it's not one person, and not two person, it's like quite a few. So I think that is a place where I see optimism, right? I mean, this younger generation of, I mean, the younger generation than myself, right? Of people who are taking action for what they believe is right. Whereas in my generation, we weren't there, right? I mean, we saw our comforts, I think, being, at least my small part of the world, right? We saw our comforts as being more important. And to a certain extent, I see similar optimism and energy. I saw similar optimism and energy in Israel in the context of the protests against the judiciary reform, which is like long time history now, right? It's like back in early and mid 2023. So that is, I mean, that's where the solutions would come from. I don't think they would come from the Bidens and the Netanyahus or that kind of generation or that kind of people. And if we do need to end on like a positive note of hope and everything, that is where I would see hope, right? At this younger generation of really inspiring people. And again, it's like that's how I feel about all this.
Well, that's my very final point to you, actually. It's about, I guess, what your hope is in terms of what you've done by speaking out, and you've documented the terrible crimes which are being committed, which is it is courageous to do with it. I mean, the power of stigma. I think, lots of people fear stigma more than they fear legal persecution, for example. I mean, stigma is a very powerful thing. One thing I'm interested, and I'm on the left. I believe change happens collectively. But a paragraph, a short passage which always had an impact on me the way I look at history is Karl Marx, 18th Premier of Louis Bonaparte, when he wrote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." By that, he means that, individuals do make their own history, but that's just constrained by grand social forces.
Yeah.
But that does mean you can make a contribution. And I'm just interested in, what do you think, is your hope this will encourage others to speak out? Will it encourage, that actually the more this crime it becomes impossible to suppress in terms of the scale? What's your hope in terms of what you speaking out will do?
I mean, so I could see this from both sides, right? Because I have been inspired by others who were braver than I am and smarter than I am, right? Who got this before I did, right? Who realized that it is imperative for them to speak out right now. And they have. And kind of seeing them and seeing what was done to them, sometimes publicly, it has inspired me, right? I mean, it's like, it's this position in which you're saying, I mean, I'm not going to pretend nothing is happening. I'm not going to pretend that our civil rights, our right of free speech are still there when they're clearly not. I mean, based on what these people are saying and what has been done to them. And then for me, again, speaking up was the answer. And on the other side, maybe to answer your question, my feeling is that, I mean, at this point, I've received a lot of critique as well, right? But a lot of support. And I think the support has been very, very important for me. People essentially, all over the world, who can email me or like message me and say that they're thankful for me speaking up. And you get the sense, I mean, I've had like several people just come up to me in different academic settings saying, "Oh, I saw this. Thank you for speaking up." And you get the sense that what you're doing is helpful. And once I realized that what I was doing was helpful for so many other people, I mean, it kind of galvanizes you, right? It makes you want to continue, because you feel, or I feel in this case, and I think you could probably say the same, that you're providing a service, right? You're speaking up where other people are not speaking up. You're stating the facts where other people are not stating the facts. You're pointing out injustices where other people prefer to be silent for their own reasons. And someone has to do that, and others have done it before me. I'm doing it now. I can see how, I mean, I want to hope that I had some tiny little impact on what other people have thought and done and realized, and that it has helped others, again, understand and take action based on their understanding that is mediated by the text that I wrote. And I mean, that's essentially what I was hoping for, right? I mean, what else can we hope for, in this context?
Well, you've certainly had a huge, I think, impact on myself and others. And I'll make sure everyone can read what you wrote in the description of the video and when I post this elsewhere. It's a hugely important contribution. History does remember voices like yours for a reason. And you do also, you put an important marker down. It was known what was happening. The information was there for those who wished to seek it out. There were no excuses. But also you encourage others to speak out. And I think people listening to you will think to themselves, we do have a responsibility and duty to speak out against evils when we do have some sort of influence potentially. And I think, that's what you've done. I think you should be incredibly proud. So do share this video for those watching. Press like, subscribe, comment. Love to hear your thoughts. But it's been a big honor to speak to you, Lee. And as I said, I think history would be very kind and you should be very proud of your contribution.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Owen, and thanks for having me on.